she told me that for years she had been drifting away from the faith, and all that her parents could tell her or other people in the church who got together with her was you have to accept the Bible, by faith. You have to just trust it and move on in experiencing the love of God. And they weren't doing anything to answer people's questions. So philosophy needs to start being taught in Sunday schools, and along with it, apologetics, to help people be able to parent their children and answer their questions, and be able to have confidence and courage to address what's going on in the culture that is against us.
Welcome to the Kalos Center Podcast. Welcome to the very first episode of the Kalos Center Podcast. We are pleased to have as our first guest J.P. Moreland. J.P. is Distinguished Professor of Philosophy at Talbot School of Theology at Biola University in La Mirada, California. J.P. has authored or edited over 30 books and has published over 100 journal articles, many in top-tier academic journals. J.P. is one of the most influential Christian apologists of the last 30 years. Some of his strongest philosophical interests include metaphysics, philosophy of mind, and philosophy of science. But J.P.'s strongest interest is his own family. He and his wife, Hope, have 2 grown daughters and now 5 grandchildren.
Well, my dear brother, it's so good to be with you and good to see you again.
It's very fitting to have you as our first guest, since much of your work has made the case for, and you have personified what the Kalos Center aims to do, which is to integrate faith and reason. In fact, your book, Love Your God with All Your Mind, is all about this, and we'll talk about that shortly. But I want to start at the beginning with you and hear about how you came to faith. When and how did you become a Christian?
Well, in 1966, I went to the University of Missouri and was a physical chemistry major. Around November of 1968, Campus Crusade, which is now called Cru, came by my fraternity house and presented a rational case, the liar, Lord, lunatic talk, that Jesus Christ really was the Son of God and that there was evidence for this. And the idea that there was evidence for this, I never heard that. And I was very interested. And so I met with a staff member, for 3 or 4 times. He gave me some things to read. And I eventually became persuaded that it was more likely than not that Christianity was true in its basic affirmations. And so the 3rd week in November of 1968, I got down on my knees and confessed my sins. And I asked Jesus to forgive me and to be my Lord and my Savior. That began the greatest adventure, with plenty of ups and downs, but that I had. I eventually, when I graduated in 1970, I had a full ride to do a PhD in nuclear chemistry at the University of Colorado, but instead, I went on the staff with what was then called Campus Crusade for Christ, and that led me into the ministry, and I've followed that ever since.
Very good. And so when and how did you come to see doing philosophy as a significant way to apply your faith?
When I was on staff with Crusade, I served 2 years at the University of Colorado and 3 at the University of Vermont, and these were skeptical schools. And I had my own questions about certain aspects of Christianity that just didn't make any sense to me or seem reasonable. And so people began to give me things to read. And one of the things I noticed, Jim, is when I read books in other fields, like historical evidence or science and Christianity, I would always have the feeling that there was something deeper down that we weren't talking about. And so people began to give me philosophy books to read. And what I found is this was what was down there, because when I read philosophy, there was nothing further down except more philosophy. So I began to realize that philosophy was, in fact, the handmaid to theology and Christianity. And that was a key insight for me. So I wanted to get to the root of what was going on and to be able to not only answer my own questions, but I was an evangelist, and I still consider myself to be committed to the Great Commission. And I began to realize that we were losing ground in this culture because we did not have enough people that were going into academic work for the kingdom. And philosophy was the most fundamental, important field that you could get into because it has its fingers in everything. So that dawned on me. I eventually went to Dallas Seminary to get biblical studies and theology. Then I went to UC Riverside for my MA, and then my USC was my PhD in philosophy. And I have found since then that I made the right decision. My philosophical training has just given me a chance to speak to radical skeptics or to just lay people and to kind of help them get clarity about things of that sort. May I make one more point? Just a week ago, or 2 weeks ago, a gentleman in our church has a daughter doing an MA in geology at the University of New Mexico, and she's abandoned the faith. And he has always told her, well, I don't know how to answer your questions, but I just know Jesus came into my life 30 years ago and he's changed my life. And that wasn't sufficient for her. So he asked if I'd get together with her. And so we met at McDonald's and we spent about an hour and a half just interacting and answering her questions and maybe pushing back a little bit graciously, but saying that you don't really know that, do you? I mean, but at the end of the day, we gave each other a big hug, and she said, this is what I've been looking for. This is somebody who takes this seriously and could understand my questions and answer them. And it was my philosophical training that let me do that.
Yeah, very good. That was my next question for you, was how you conceive of the calling of the Christian philosopher. You've touched on that, and these are some excellent examples. Can you say more about how a Christian philosopher should be serving God's kingdom?
Years ago, Alvin Plantinga wrote a paper called Advice to Christian Philosophers. And in that paper, he basically said that if you're going to be a Christian philosopher, you have to commit yourself to the lordship of Jesus Christ and recognize that you're serving him and his people first. Now, we, of course, serve the non-Christian community, but that's as Christian philosophers. And so for me, my calling is to begin with biblical teaching and to develop philosophical arguments for the core commitments of Christianity that don't depend on Scripture. So I'm trying to come up with arguments that say that there is a soul, for example, makes a lot of sense. It's not something that's just you just believe with your eyes closed because religion says so. No, the evidence for that is really, really good. And on it goes for other things. And so I wanted to be able to make the case as a Christian philosopher for a whole range of things that were being criticized by a secular culture. And hopefully that would create a plausibility structure in the culture where people would consider the Christian faith plausible and be willing to listen to it. And then I wanted to train others to do the same thing. And so it was an expression of the lordship of Christ in the field of philosophy, trying to integrate philosophy with other fields of study that would produce a coherent worldview and help people understand that there's a lot of reason to believe this is the best worldview going.
Yeah, very good. So this is sometimes called pre-evangelism.
Absolutely.
Right. We're addressing issues, often impediments, obstacles to even hearing the gospel, such that now you can get it into a realm of, as you say, plausibility, that, at least this is possible. And then you can go from there. And you mentioned Alvin Plantinga, who's just a towering figure for those who don't know much about philosophy, in what's been called a renaissance in Christian philosophy over the last 50 years.
Yes.
Can you talk about that? What led to this, and talk about the impact that's had in the broader world of academic philosophy?
Absolutely. Up until that time, which is around 1970 or somewhere around a little later, maybe, secularism had come to dominate the academic fields in the university. And that trickled down into the culture. It trickled into providing a backdrop for people in the media and the entertainment industry. They didn't know they were, skeptics in epistemology, but they had absorbed that from their college training. And Christianity was just not considered a topic that could be discussed rationally in a classroom unless it was to critique it. Now, there were Christian philosophers, but they lacked courage. They didn't know other Christian philosophers. There was not any way to connect with each other. And so a group of highly regarded Christian philosophers who were at the top of the field, William Alston, Alvin Plantinga, and others, came together to form the Society of Christian Philosophers, whose job was to take people who consider themselves Christians and philosophers and give them a community where they could work out their Christian faith in the field of philosophy and begin to develop more connectedness and courage to reach out on the universities. And what happened, Jim, was that more and more people began to read their stuff and go into college and major in philosophy. So it began to draw people to the discipline. And then I wanted to go on and get my PhD so I could be a part of that drawing. But I think what happened was that there was, and continues to be, an explosion. What's happened is that there are now well-regarded Christian philosophers in every branch of philosophy. And you can't pick up a journal without there being a Christian theist making some point in that journal. So you can no longer ignore us. And if a professor in a classroom says, well, Christianity is just ridiculous, it's stupid, it's superstitious, it's only for people that are uneducated, that person ought to be ashamed of himself or herself, because that is not true any longer. And he or she needs to come up to speed and read a little bit in his own field.
So the MA program in philosophy, or philosophy of religion, at Biola's Talbot School of Theology has played a significant role in this historical development. Can you talk about your original vision for this and how that's played out in practice?
Yes, thanks for asking. I came to Talbot in 1990 with the hope of starting an MA program. And Scott Ray, who is a bioethicist and a business ethicist, who has his PhD from USC, he and I were given permission to start an MA program in philosophy to see how it went. So we went to McDonald's, got a napkin out, literally, and began to write down what our values would be. And so the first thing we did was to conceive of our department, not as a department, but as a movement designed to embody, to equip, and to produce books and articles and talks on behalf of Christianity that centered around a set of values. One of them was to become academically rigorous Christian philosophers and thinkers. That was number one. We valued the life of the mind. And so we used the same secular books that people use in secular doctoral programs. We didn't use basically Christian books unless there was one that was really outstanding, like one by Richard Swinburne, let's say, or Plantinga, or something like that. The second value was that we wanted our students to be formed spiritually and fall more and more in love with Jesus. And so that meant that we had electives in spiritual formation. We encouraged them to get Christian therapy and to deal with their maybe anxiety and depression, and to grow in their affection for God and to deal with their issues. The third was that we were a community of people. We're not competing. We're not going to share with each other our grades. We want everybody to be doing well because we're all soldiers on the same team. And so if there are people that aren't doing well, find the people that are, and the people that are, raise your hands and help them. We want everybody to be successful. And then for the fourth value is that we are activists. We're not just scholars, but we're scholar activists, which means that we need to find a way to take our gifting and our circumstances of life and to serve the kingdom of God and the scriptures as Christian philosophers in the various areas of our lives. And so what we've done in the years that we started in the early 70s is if we've placed, I'm going to guess 230 to 240 of our graduates into top PhD programs in Europe, Canada, and America. And we now have 90 to 100 tenure-track professors in secular schools and Christian schools that are faithfully doing their work, writing, publishing, teaching great classes. And so we're just trying to be a little bit of leaven out there. That's all. And we're trying to leaven the whole thing. And yeah, that was the vision.
Yeah, that's pretty understated given the impact.
Well,
and you've far surpassed your original goal.
Our original goal was 100 students. And when I see these students and what they're doing, I just think, good Lord, I hope they don't come back because they've gone way beyond me.
Yeah. Isn't that a great feeling when you feel surpassed by your students? It's just so gratifying.
And unless they ask me a philosophical question and I don't understand it, that's not a great feeling. But, but the rest of it is.
Yeah, that's good. So what are some of the challenges facing the church today, particularly in the West and more specifically in America, that beg for input from Christian philosophers?
Well, the church is just flat out anti-intellectual. I mean, take this girl that I met with at McDonald's. She told me that for years she had been drifting away from the faith, and all that her parents could tell her or other people in the church who got together with her was you have to accept the Bible, by faith. You have to just trust it and move on in experiencing the love of God. And they weren't doing anything to answer people's questions. So philosophy needs to start being taught in Sunday schools and along with it, apologetics to help people be able to parent their children and answer their questions and be able to have confidence and courage to address what's going on in the culture that is against us. So now what would some of those issues be? Well, is there science the only way to know reality? Or are there other ways to know reality? That's certainly one of them. For the engineers and scientists in our churches, and even pushing back against those that aren't believers, to make the case that there are fundamental ways of knowing reality that have nothing to do with the empirical methods of science. It's a both and, not an either or. But we need to teach people that it's possible to know objective moral value. We need to give them arguments for God's existence and to deal with the questions they're getting at work. I think we need to be moving into some metaphysics, which is basically the study of the a priori study of reality, meaning that you want to know about reality by simply thinking about it. And there are all kinds of things. Is there a soul? Is there free will? What is that? Are there things that exist that you can't see, but that we know are real? Now, there'll be skeptics, but there are positive answers to those questions, that the visible world just is not the only reality there is. So that plus ethical questions are part of the secular culture. And maybe I could say that, in my opinion, setting Islam aside, the two major competitors for the hearts and minds of people today, in addition to what I would call Christian monotheism or biblical monotheism, would be scientific naturalism. Physical world is all there is, or if there's anything besides that, it depends on the physical world for its existence. The best way to know reality, maybe the only way, is through the hard sciences, and everything else is opinion. The other one would be what you might call critical theory or radical postmodernism, which is sometimes called cynical theory. Being woke is to adopt this view. And it's roughly the idea that identity groups, like fat people, there are now fat studies in the universities, LGBTQ people, feminists, and there are several identity groups, and they construct reality according to their own views and beliefs. There is no such thing as objective reality. If there were, you couldn't know it anyway. And that we can only project outside of ourselves a shared created reality that we all agree with. And the important thing about our constructed reality is the power it gives us to counteract the power that has governed Western culture, namely Judeo-Christian worldview, and to undermine the power that comes from that, not by truth, but by finding ways of ridiculing and so on. So those would be some of the things I think are absolutely essential. And we're fighting a war, Jim, for the hearts and minds of people, that people don't take Christianity as all that plausible. And so they're not really willing to hear about it. I'll give you a classic example of this. My granddaughter just graduated from, or is just graduating this spring, from a Lutheran solid Christian high school. Now, they had a speaker come in about the pro-life movement, and there were about 60% of the students in this school that were pro-choice. Now, my daughter works with live action. She's 43. Her daughter goes there, and she's a pro-life advocate. She said, "Dad, what is going on? Why is this happening?" And I said, "Well, there are two reasons, I think. And the first one is that people don't really know the fundamental issues and arguments on both sides. They hear slogans and that's it. So we need to teach Christians the fundamental basis and the reasons for a pro-life position and critique the pro-choice condition. But I think the other one is that they are not ravished with a Christian view of following Jesus. It looks boring. Being able to have sex with whomever you want and getting out of your parents' control and creating your own path and doing your own thing and not hurting other people, supposedly. That is where life is really at, man. I mean, that's the exciting stuff. The people who are movie actors or rock singers, they're the ones who've got life. Christianity, I think it's true, but it's just stinking boring. I mean, it's just a bunch of rules that constrain your life. And that's what we're presenting to them. But what we've got to start doing is to say, following Jesus is the most exciting, meaningful approach to life that you could ever have, far outstripping these alternatives, and then make the case for that. Give them a vision for what can come from loving and following Jesus and his words. So I don't think that we've done that, and I think that we need to do that.
That's great. So it is fascinating just to observe our culture and the extremes that people are going to try to generate meaning, even to the point of trying to redefine themselves or create a completely different identity. It's all symptomatic of this universal quest for meaning, isn't it?
Absolutely.
And I've been fascinated also by how, say 30 years ago with the rise of postmodernism, or as that was really impacting culture, starting to impact culture more broadly, the watchword was a kind of skepticism, or as Lyotard, the French philosopher, would put it, a kind of incredulity towards all meta-narratives, right? We're going to be skeptical about all worldviews. But as the decades rolled on and we arrived at our present cultural moment, it seems everybody's dogmatic. The skepticism is gone and dogmatic certainty about the most bizarre things, right? That we can completely reconstruct or socially devise our own identities, even about things as fundamental as our sexuality, our gender.
Well, isn't it ironic what you're saying? I mean, you go from a skeptical posture, and the difficulty with that is that you would have to be skeptical of your own views if you care about being consistent. Now, if you don't care about being consistent, then you lose your right to be heard, because what you're now doing is whenever you espouse your views, it's merely an assertion of power. a bald-faced assertion of that you should have power and we should submit to you. And I'm sorry, but that's not going to work for me because I base my life on what I think's true. I could be wrong in some cases, but I do my best to reason things out. And you're denying all that. So if you don't believe in consistency, you're dangerous. You're just asserting things out of nowhere, out of your belly button, and you're pounding the pulpit. But now, if you care about consistency, if you're going to say that there's no reality and there's no truth that's really objective, that's going to have to apply to your own views. And the difficulty then is, why should people listen to your views? It opens up a relativism gone monk. And so a lot of the people began to realize that they really did think their own woke position was true. They really did. And so they began to recapture that, but then they were stuck with this contradiction right in the center of their behavior. So it was a pretty tough place to be, but you're right, that's what's been happening a decade and a half, 2 decades, something like that.
So a lot of these issues come down to what's called philosophical anthropology. Right.
Amen.
What is your philosophical view on what a human being is? Now, you're a substance dualist.
Yeah.
Why do you believe that's superior to competing theories?
Yes. May I just give one background statement? We have a lot of things. We have cars. We have mixers that blend, protein drinks. We have televisions, and I wouldn't want to try to use my television as a blender for protein drinks, and I wouldn't want to use my car as a doorstop because I'd have to tear the walls down to get the car in. The point is that things flourish if you use them according to their nature and their purpose, and so you try to use the television according to what it was made for, and then you got a chance for that television to have a life period where it works and it really helps. Now, the same's true of humans. How a human being should live depends upon what I would say human person is. So if you just make up anything that is the way I would like to live, then you're going to bump up against reality. And if that's not the way you were made to function and flourish, you're eventually going to find out that you're destroying your life. You're not enhancing a virtuous and a happy and joyful life. And so, to me, the question of how we should live is grounded or rooted in what is, as you pointed out, a human being or a human person. And so that is now the fundamental issue that is being debated on the university campuses. Every field has a view of a human person, and there are implications of those views. Now, that's why I went into philosophy of mind, which is the study of let's just focus on humans. What are we? Are we a mind and a body, or just a body or brain? What do we make of us? I believe that the scriptures teach that we are souls that are embodied, and that our body is a set of organs and tools that we use while embodied to accomplish things. So I use my eardrums to hear, my eyes to see, but my eyes don't see, I see by using my eyes. If they get damaged, then I'm missing a tool. But that doesn't mean that the eyes were what saw. It's consistent with that they were a tool for me to use. So the question for me is, what is the me? What's the I here? And for a number of reasons, I believe that consciousness is not physical. Like water can be in the state of solid, liquid, and gas, but it's still water. Consciousness can be in at least 5 states. There are states of having a sensation. That might be the taste of a lemon or a feeling of pain. There is a state called a thought, where you may be driving your car and a thought comes into your mind. And the thought might be, I think that it could start raining later in the month. And you don't know if it's true or not. It's just a thought. You don't believe it. It's a thought. Another one are beliefs. Those are thoughts or semantic contents or propositional contents that you take to be true from 51 to 100%. You can vary in the strength of the belief. Those vary. The strength of the beliefs do. But beliefs, there are desires. That's a felt inclination towards or away from the dentist. And then finally, there are acts of will, what I would consider voluntary acts. Those are all states of consciousness. And the reason I believe that is that there are things that are true of those states that aren't true of brain states, so they can't be the same thing. Just a simple example is that for all my conscious states, there is a what it's like to be in that state. For example, there's a what it's like to have a pain. There's a what it's like to taste a strawberry. There's a what it's like to be thinking about George Washington. And that differs from the what it's like or the experiential texture of thinking about the Pythagorean theorem. And that's why I can know what I'm thinking about by simply introspecting and paying attention to my thoughts, because they have discernible textures that I can become aware of. But no brain state has a what it's like to it. There's no what it's like for a set of neurons to be firing. There's no what it's like to be an electron or to be in the state of negative charge. There's no phenomenal experiential texture to any of that. So conscious states have things, what it's like that physical states, including brain states, don't have, so they can't be the same thing. So all you can do is correlate the two, that I think, and show causal relationships. If you get hit, maybe your brain will begin to spark in a certain way, and that'll bring about the experience, the mental experience of pain. All right, that's what's called property dualism. Now, what about substance dualism, which is basically the view that not only is my consciousness immaterial or mental, but I am an immaterial substance. That means that I am a unity, a primitive unity of properties and powers, that's powers or dispositions to act or to do different things. I remain the same through change. I have properties, but I am not had by anything more basic. I'm fundamental, and that I can grow and gain and lose parts and still be the same, literally the same individual substance as I was 10 years ago. Say I lose my arms, it's still I. And so those are reasons, that's what a substance would be. And that means that I am not a physical object, but that I am embodied, but I am the thing that's embodied. And so those would be what dualism is, and there are different varieties of it, but maybe that's enough. I don't know.
That's good. Yeah, even mainstream philosophers, Frank Jackson, and even an atheist like Thomas Nagel have noted some of these problems over the years in terms of physicalism or naturalist view of human nature that says we're just physical parts. The inability of physicalism to explain these things, as you mentioned, personal identity through time, and this irreducible first-person quality of our experience.
Yes, absolutely.
It is just a persistent problem with physicalism, to the point where Thomas Nagel, in a book about 10 years ago called Mind and Cosmos, he recognizes, even if the subtitle, he notes that the materialist neo-Darwinian view of the universe is almost certainly false. So it's a theory in crisis, and dualists are right to point this out, and even use some of the arguments that some of these mainstream naturalists recognize are strong objections. Now,
absolutely.
There's a whole other category of arguments for mind-body dualism that has a lot of popular appeal, and that is near-death experiences. You've done a fair amount of work on this. How should that impact our thinking about human nature?
Well, two things. I think that you have to realize that there have been around 300 million of these that have happened throughout the world. 1 in every 25 persons in this country, in Germany, and some European countries have had a near-death experience. And there have now been tens of thousands of these that have been carefully studied and subjected to rigorous academic standards of survey taking and so on. And so as a result, we've learned that people born blind who've had near-death experiences see for the first time. They don't have words for color, but they can be given a word for darker or lighter, but they see things that are verified that they couldn't have known, like if they were in a home for people that are blind. They for the first time, they can see that there is a purple spot on their roommate's head that they had no idea about, and they report this. So the point is that there are now so many verified endings, and there's a core that's the same worldwide, even though some of the interpretations might be different. But these are almost all biblically consistent. And if you want proof of that, read John Burke's book, Imagine Heaven, where he goes into what we're learning about in these experiences, and do they conflict with the Bible or comport? And he says the overwhelming majority of these are consistent with Scripture. There's what you would expect. And they're not what you would expect if Hinduism were true, or Buddhism, or anything like that. So I think that near-death experiences have been a powerful set of evidence, especially those that have been verified by doctors and nurses as to what people saw and so on, that there's more to us than our bodies. And in fact, we have a soul or a self, an immaterial I, call it what you want, that can be on the ceiling and look down and say, there's my body, that's my body. And you're up here and you're different from your body. And you leave and different things happen to you, and you come back and you're embodied again when you didn't want to be. But God sent you back because you had work to do. So I would say that it's provided a tremendous amount of evidence that the soul is real. There's another way it's provided evidence that people might not think about, and this is that it supports what's called the modal argument for the soul. Now it goes like this. There's something true about me. Namely, I am possibly disembodiable. Maybe there's no afterlife, but certainly such a thing is possible. And we find that people who watch, 48 Hours or Dateline programs on near-death experiences, almost all of them are saying, look, I'm kind of skeptical of these things. But look, I want to hear what the evidence is. So I want to listen to the program and see what do they got, which means they're telling us that they agree that these things are possible. They want to know if they happened. Okay? So if there's something true about me, namely, I am the kind of thing that could possibly exist disembodied. So let's look at the evidence. Well, I know one thing about my brain and body. They're not even possibly the kinds of things that could exist disembodied. I don't know what a disembodied brain would be, a non-material brain or a disembodied body. Your body and your brain are essentially physical. They couldn't be non-physical, so they are not even possibly disembodiable, but I am. So near-death experiences show that at least it's possible that I could be disembodied. Now, that doesn't prove life after death, but what it shows is there's something true about me that ain't true about my brain and body, so we can't be the same thing. And moreover, I've got to be the kind of thing that could exist without a brain and a body, that is a soul or a spirit of some kind. So I think they've been helpful. On the other hand, you got to be careful. There are some things out there, but you got to read up to be wise about how to discern. And Burke's book will help you discern on that.
Yeah, there's further corroboration as well by the fact that some of these experiences happen when there is a confirmed flat EEG. There's no recordable brain activity going on, and yet people are having perceptions, are having a very robust thoughts and feelings, which should register in terms of brain activity. While that's going on, they acquire new information. And so all that confirms that, okay, there's thinking going on without brain activity. That's exactly what the mind-body dualist would predict.
Yes. And you can't explain that as a physicalist because thinking is just brain activity that may function in your behavior in the right kind of way. If there's no brain activity going on, which there isn't, for up to sometimes a long period of time, then you can't be thinking. But you are thinking because you can report what you were thinking about that can be verified by the doctors and nurses. And so that's a great point.
So our listeners should know this is a massive industry. There are organizations, including the International Association for Near-Death Studies. You can go on their website and read literally thousands of personal testimonies, neardeath.com. You have all sorts of YouTube programs which have been proliferating over recent years, like Next Level Soul and others. And it's just one personal testimony after another of near-death experiences. Like you say, though, one must be wise and discerning because sometimes people mistakenly put into this category what are just called out-of-body experiences, which might be, say, drug-induced, or they could be induced by some sort of occult activity. So, listener, reader, beware.
Absolutely.
But we can't throw the tremendous mountain of evidence that is the baby in that bathwater, and it's worth careful inquiry.
Amen, brother. I'm with you 100%.
So connected with this to some degree, coming back to philosophy of science, is inferences to intelligent design. That you've defended appeals to intelligent design in scientific inquiry. All right, what is intelligent design, and why may this be a legitimate scientific inference?
Well, intelligent design is the view that by using certain ideas, which I'll tell you in a minute, we can detect in the natural world cases where something was an effect by a rational, intelligent subject, an agent, a person, and not laws of nature or random. And that the inference to the fact that this is the byproduct of a rational agent or person can be a scientific inference. It's not a philosophical inference, though there are philosophical uses of this. But it's important that people know that because we live in a day when science is considered the supreme or only way to know reality, and I don't think that's true. But if you hold that, well, what do you do with the fact that there seems to be evidence for God in the information in the natural world, and that's a scientific conclusion. Now the question is it really? And that's what you'd have to do next. There is something called the design filter. And if you're looking at some event or some phenomenon and it passes the design filter, there are almost no false positives. That means it is almost guaranteed that the event was brought about by a rational person. Now, this design filter is used in several branches of science. For example, it is used in forensic science. It is used in archaeology to determine whether this is an artifact that was made by a rational agent or it's produced by erosion or a rock. It's used by anthropology. Not long ago, there were certain kind of shapes in a cave where they knew Neanderthals had lived in there. And there was a debate about whether those were natural patterns that were just erosion in the cave or if it was something that was produced intentionally by the Neanderthals. And the evidence was that this was produced by rational agents who were trying to depict something that represented life after death or whatever, I don't remember exactly what that was. So it was used to settle the dispute in the science of anthropology. It's used in SETI, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. Now, you may think there's nothing out there, that doesn't matter, but the search for it is clearly a scientific project, and they will be able to tell the difference between a signal that's coming from a person and just random noise or something produced by a law of nature. So this filter is used in several branches of science. There the scientists themselves use this filter. And the filter goes like this. Take some phenomenon. Is the phenomenon the result of a law of nature? Or is it contingent? That means that it happened, but it could have not happened even with the same laws of nature. So what you have is you're studying some phenomena. Let's say some organ in a frog. And you ask, is this something that was highly improbable and that there would be a frog that would develop this kind of organ? And if the answer is, yeah, that's very improbable, which it almost always is. And then you have to ask a second question, because if we're playing bridge and we're playing for $500 and I'm the dealer and I deal myself a perfect bridge hand, you may think I'm cheated. But wait, why? Because that hand's improbable. Yeah, but so is yours. Your hand is equally improbable as mine, even though it's just a random collection of cards. But if I had predicted you'd get that random collection of cards before the deal, you'd think something was up. Improbability is necessary, but not sufficient. There has to be something else. And that is, there's something very special about this particular phenomenon besides the fact that it happened. Okay, take the bridge deal. There's something special about my hand besides the fact that it's the one I got. And what's special about it is that there's something independent of me getting it, the rules of bridge that say anybody who gets that hand wins. So it's the combination of it being improbable but independently special that indicates that I cheated and that this deal of cards was done by a rational agent on purpose to win the kitty. There's nothing special about your hands. It's just the hand you happen to get. Now, this was used in a court of law to demonstrate that the Republicans had cheated in the balloting for state elections in the state of Ohio. And what happened was there were a group of local districts that were having elections. And there were like 8 parties running in each of those districts. Green Party, all kinds of, they had 8 parties. And in the ballots that were sent out to all of these districts, the Republican candidate was listed first among the 8 parties on all of the different districts' ballots. Now, we ask, how likely is that to happen? Very unlikely. But I mean, after all, if Republican, Democrat, and Green Party had been the first 3 on all the ballots, I mean, that could have been, but so it's improbable, but is there anything special about it? My gosh, we know that whoever is listed first on a ballot gets more votes just because they're listed first. And guess who made the ballots? A Republican. And so in court, they've charged this guy with fraud because they said that these were produced intentionally by a person who did it on purpose, namely this guy here, the Republican ballot maker. And it made sense because this didn't happen randomly, and it was certainly special because whoever's there first wins and so on. So we have examples of this in science. There are structures in organisms that contain, let's say, 50 to 100 different parts. Now, the idea that these precise 50 parts would randomly come together in that specific structure, so it's those parts in that structure, is highly improbable. Okay? But improbable things happen all the time. But there's something else that weighs here, and that is that structure is the only one that's going to help that organism move and get food and avoid enemies. Why? Because if you move one single part out of that 50, it won't work. If you add a part to it, it becomes a dysfunctional slab of chemicals that are a part of the organism. Only if that precise 50 in that structure are present will it help the organism survive. And so the fact that it happened and it's fits the design filter indicates that this is something that was engineered, and it could not have happened randomly, because if you have 3 or 4 or 5, 6, up to 49 of those parts together, it's going to hinder the organism. It's not going to help. It's going to be dead weight. And so it's only until that 50th part drops into place in the right structure that you get something that's survival enhancing. And so that's what, and the idea that this is intelligently designed is the best explanation of that. So that would be the argument.
That's very good. Yeah, this is sometimes regarded or referred to as a kind of fine-tuning argument for the existence of some higher intelligence. Fine-tuning arguments have also been devised in the context of the inanimate physical world and how all the different laws of nature are just right for the very possibility of life in the universe.
That's
Robin
right.
Collins and others have developed that argument. We don't have time to talk about that, but fine-tuning arguments for the existence of God, whether they regard inanimate nature or living organisms, and at every level, we're talking about cellular biology or just even basic proteins, what we call basic proteins.
Yes.
Phil, it would require dozens, even scores or hundreds of amino acids that are all levo or left-handed forms. And that's just for the possibility of, a protein there, let alone cell walls and different organelles. And then at the more macro level, the different organ systems and how they work together. It's quite fascinating. But as a scientist, given, as you laid out so wonderfully, it is a legitimate move to make, to infer some sort of intelligent mind or consciousness, a designer that's responsible for this. It should be a perfectly legitimate scientific inference.
And if the evidence warrants that inference, make it. I mean, the issue is whether the evidence justifies it or not. Not what kind of inference it is. And I think what we're saying is, if you look at the facts, this fits the design filter. It fits what psychologists do, what forensics, all these other branches of science do. So what's your problem? You don't like this, I think.
That's good. Yeah, maybe there's something else going on here besides just the reasonableness of this inference that's prompting you to reject it.
I think you may be onto something.
Yeah. So we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about metaphysics. We've talked about philosophy of mind and philosophy of science. These are all areas where you've done wonderful work. I want to close just by asking you another kind of boilerplate question that I'm asking all of our guests, which really is the question that people expect philosophers to address, but most philosophers, even Christian philosophers, never publish on this particular question. And it has to do with the meaning of life. Okay. So JP, what is your view of the meaning of life, and how has your professional work aimed to work out that conviction in practice?
Well, let me do a two-step answer to that question. Let me first of all say that if there is not a theistic God who cares about us and put us here for a purpose, then there would be no meaning to life. And let me explain why. If God does not exist and you say that the material world is all there is, that's a popular Western version of atheism, then you're not going to have free will, because you're just going to be a physical object, complicated one, no doubt. But whatever inputs into your brain and nervous system is going to be determined by the laws of physics and chemistry that will generate an output. And there's no room for free will to have any role in your behavior. And scientists believe that everything is either determined or at the quantum level indeterminate. And if your behavior is indeterminate, then it's random. So that's not going to help there be anything like free will. The other thing is that there's no teleology. That means there's nothing that happens for the sake of a purpose or an end. That has been almost universally acknowledged since the 1600s to have gone the way of the dodo. And teleological explanations are not considered plausible scientific explanations for things. But so I put the problem for the naturalist atheist as follows. Suppose I invited you to my house to play a game of Monopoly. And I said, we're going to do this a little different, Jim. Stay with me. Over there on the table is a set of jacks. You can toss the ball up and grab some jacks if you want. It's your turn. Over there's a coin. You can flip it and see whether it lands on heads or tails. There's a Monopoly board. You can just put hotels everywhere you want. You can put hotels, and just when you're finished, you just tell me. And one other thing, there's the fridge. When it's your turn, you can go in there if you want and fix a sandwich. And so it's up to you what you do when it's your turn. Okay, it's your turn. I'll let you start. So you say, gosh, so you put hotels, you use up all the hotels and put them around the board. And you look at me with a smug face and say, it's your turn now. And I get up and I sweep everything off of the board and I flip a coin. And it ends up heads, let's say. And I said, okay, it's your turn. You think, boy, that was wild. I'm going to do that again. So you put the hotels back again. And you're a little leery this time, but you say, okay, it's your turn. I go to the fridge and I fix myself a turkey and cheese sandwich. Now, it wouldn't take too many iterations of this for you to recognize that it didn't matter what you did when it was your turn. And here's why. If there is no purpose to the game as a whole, there's no meaning to the individual things that you do in the game. Because the meaning or lack thereof of the individual moves that we make depend upon whether there is meaning to life as a whole. And so the only way that can make sense to me, the most sense, is if there is a theistic God that created me to have value so that I and my choices are valuable, and gave me a free will, and I have the ability to act for the sake of a purpose or an end. And that meaning in life, therefore, for me, is to live my life so as to, one, know and love God as much as I can, and two, become as much as I can like Jesus Christ and embody the fruit of the Spirit in Galatians and work on that until I'm gone. So I want to become a certain kind of person. And the third thing is that I am to serve Jesus Christ with my natural talents and spiritual gifts and my, what I'm going to call, historical setting where I live, and if I'm married, who I'm married to, who my friends are. So my service will depend upon my unique, let me just say, calling, which will be grounded in my life circumstances and my natural talents and spiritual gifts. Now, this will include loving others and caring for them. There's all kinds of things that are packed under each one of these. But to state it briefly again, the purpose of my life is to live in such a way that I embody three things. One, I grow continually in my love for and knowledge of God Himself. Number two, I become a different kind of person as I grow, namely to become like Jesus in my circumstances and embody the fruit of the Spirit. And then finally, given my place of existence and my talents and gifts, find a way to serve the kingdom of God and the Lord Jesus and other people in my unique way, better and better as I go on. And then I would enjoy heaven with God after I've finished that.
Very good. Thank you. I think with that will conclude. It's a fitting end to our conversation. So thank you again.
This is such an important thing you're doing. It's a part of the solution. And I want to just urge you not to get discouraged, to keep doing this, get great guests on, you guys weigh in, and this is going to make a difference over time. I'm so excited about your work.
Thank you. We're excited. Our next guest is David Bahnsen, who's a head of a major investment firm, and he's a frequent guest on Fox News, and we got a number of other people lined up, so we're excited.
God bless you, man.
Thank you for listening to the Kalos Center Podcast. We gave you our thoughts. Now let us know what you think. Email us at podcast@kalos.center.